Good morning, faithful listener. You are listening to the Bible Explained podcast, where the Bible gets explained. So grab your cup of coffee and stay tuned as we read through the book of John. Good morning, faithful listeners. You have tuned into the Bible Explained podcast. And hi, my name is Jenn. I am the host here for those of you who are new. And I'm excited that you chose to turn on this podcast to read and study the scriptures with me, because today we're going to be talking about John chapter 1, and we're going to be finishing up John 1 and moving into John chapter 2 next week. So today we're going to read John chapter 1, verses 43 through 51 today, all the way to the end of the chapter. Don't forget to go and grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea. Feel free to pause the podcast and grab that, and also grab the Bible in the version that you prefer. I'll be reading a WEB this morning, so sit back and relax, and let's read this together. John 1, 43 through 51. Before I begin reading, I just want to comment that this is talking about Jesus. So it says, on the next day, he was determined to go out into Galilee, and he found Philip, and Jesus said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, of the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can any good thing come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him, and he said about him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I told you I saw you underneath the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." He said to him, "Most certainly I tell you, hereafter you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." So at this point in time, where we started today, we know that Jesus has acquired 3 disciples. And now he has a 4th. So it says on the next day after all this happened, and after he met Peter and Peter became a disciple, it says he was determined to go out into Galilee, and he found Philip. And Jesus asks Philip to become one of his disciples, which is interesting because it doesn't actually say if Jesus and Philip knew each other beforehand, though I do believe it's assumed because it says here that Philip was from the same city that Andrew and Peter were from. So potentially Philip was one of John the Baptist's disciples, it could be, and knew of Andrew and Peter, or knew of Jesus. Perhaps Jesus had spoken to him in the past before, because we do know that some of Jesus's disciples, Jesus had spoken to them in the past, but they didn't become his disciples until later on. But we don't know really a lot about Philip. He's actually not mentioned hardly at all. Just a handful of times throughout the scriptures. I think Philip was actually the one that calculated the amount of bread and fish needed to feed a multitude of 5,000. But other than that, he's not really mentioned, except here in scripture when he first becomes a disciple, and then later on with the 5,000 feeding that happens. But it says that Philip early on went and found his friend Nathanael, and we don't know the relationship between Philip and Nathanael. They could have just been good friends. They could have been comrades. They could have been related somehow. We don't know. But it says that after Philip became a disciple of Jesus, and by the way, if Philip had just met Jesus, like let's say that Philip had never met Jesus before, it really took an amount of faith to go and follow Jesus. If Jesus found Philip and was just like, "Follow me." I mean, that's an amount of faith that Philip really had. And Philip knew very early on that Jesus was in fact the Messiah, because it says that Philip found Nathanael, and he said to Nathanael, "We have found him of whom Moses wrote about and all the prophets wrote about, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." And so what Philip is saying here is that the prophets had written about Jesus in times past. So Philip is alluding to the fact that Jesus is in fact the Messiah of whom the prophets of old have spoken about. So Nathanael who's a very interesting person. And most people believe that Nathanael is also named Bartholomew. Bartholomew, we know, was one of Jesus's disciples. So a lot of people back in Jesus's day had two names. I don't know why. Maybe just because of the multiple languages that were going on. But Nathanael is most likely also Bartholomew. But John calls him Nathanael here. So it says that Nathanael was like laughing over the fact that Jesus was from Nazareth. So he says, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? So there was some sort of like bias going on here. We don't know why Nathanael hated Nazareth. I don't know why. Maybe it was just not a very nice area of the time period. I live in Ohio, and Ohioans are like really prejudiced for whatever reason against Pennsylvania. And I don't know why. I was raised in Pennsylvania, and I don't remember anybody particularly disliking Ohioans. But when I came over here to Ohio, there's like a prejudice against Pennsylvania. And it's kind of true. Like Pennsylvania, at least the area that I grew up in, is like less maintained in general than Ohio is. But I don't know why there's a prejudice in Ohio against the state of Pennsylvania, but there is one. So for whatever reason, Nathanael had a prejudice against Nazareth. And it sounds to me like there was a lot of prejudices happening back in these days. Nathanael didn't like Nazareth. And he's like, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Like, psh, Nazareth. I don't know why. But so Philip doesn't even answer this question, which is really funny. He's just like, just come and see. Come and see how Jesus is. You know, I can't convince you unless you see him. So Nathanael listens to Philip, and so he comes to Jesus, and Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him. So Jesus says, behold, here is an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit. And I love that because basically what Jesus is saying to Nathanael is that Nathanael just doesn't lie. And I mean, that's very true. The very first thing Nathanael says is, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? So, I mean, he didn't hold anything back. Like, he just stated his prejudices out in the open. And so, and Jesus is like, there's no deceit in this guy right here. And so Nathanael's like, how do you know me? Because it doesn't sound like Philip told Jesus that he was going to bring Nathanael, but Jesus knew Nathanael's name. And he knew about Nathanael's character. He knew that there wasn't any deceit and that, you know, Nathanael was like a true Israelite. So, I mean, this was a compliment, you know, that Jesus was saying. I mean, the Israelite heritage was very, very important to Israelites. And I'm sure Nathanael prided himself on being an Israelite and being very studied in, you know, Hebrew and everything else, because it says that he was actually like meditating in the scriptures before he met Jesus. But Nathanael's like, well, how do you know me here? And so Jesus answered him, before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you. So at some point in time, Nathanael was sitting under a fig tree studying the scriptures. I actually live in a forest, and there's a bench that I have that's under this like big oak tree that I like to sit on sometimes. And I'll go out there and I'll bring my little crocheting. And sometimes I'll sit under there and read my Bible when it's like warm outside. I mean, I would be pretty flabbergasted if somebody came up to me and was like, I saw you sitting under your oak tree. I would be like, what kind of a stalker are you? But there was no possible way for Jesus to have known this, because it wasn't like Jesus had ever met Nathanael before. And in Nathanael's mind, there's no way that Jesus could have really known who he was, you know? And so this is shocking to Nathanael that Jesus says this, that Jesus mentioned a very specific thing that Nathanael was doing under a very specific type of tree. And so Nathanael's like, Rabbi, you're the Son of God. You are King of Israel. So Nathanael is just like shocked that Jesus saw him sitting and meditating under that fig tree. So Jesus answered him, because I told you I saw you underneath the fig tree, you believe? You're going to see greater things than that. So he's like, Nathanael, that's like nothing. If you follow me, you're going to see way bigger things than that. So then he says to Nathanael, most certainly I tell you, hereafter you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man. So what this means, and a lot of people have speculated actually that was the portion of scripture that Nathanael was meditating on under the fig tree, which very well could be like Jesus really solidifying that he knew Nathanael in and out. And perhaps Nathanael was reading the story in Genesis where Jacob saw the ladder and the angels ascending and descending on it. It's very possible. Because honestly, if you're looking at this, it kind of seems to us like sort of just randomly stuck in there, I guess. But maybe to Nathanael, this was just absolutely amazing that Jesus potentially knew what portion of scripture Nathanael was like meditating on that very morning under the fig tree. However, it's not a random statement that Jesus said. If you go back to the story of Jacob's ladder and you read it, you'll see that there was a ladder where the angels were coming up and down from heaven. And, Jacob chalked it up to the place that he was sleeping in being a very holy place. But the fact is, Jesus is saying that he is actually that ladder. He's that bridge from heaven to earth. And Nathanael is going to be able to see that. Jesus bridging the gap between heaven and earth. There's a really wonderful song that I love. It's Living Hope by Phil Wickham, where it says how great the chasm that lay between us. And I mean, that is so true. There was a chasm. Like, there is no way that we can ever get past that chasm and get into heaven on our own. It is impossible. We are sin-filled. We live in a sin-filled world. But Jesus bridged that chasm. He became that ladder from heaven to earth and vice versa. And that's what Jesus is saying here to Nathanael. This is another statement of Jesus being God. There are so many people out there that are like, Jesus never claimed to be God, so we can't actually say that he is God. But I mean, right here, how can you say that you're the bridge from heaven to earth? Like, how can a person say that if they aren't God? Like, this is definitely a statement of Jesus being God, and he's claiming to Nathanael, I am the Messiah. I am God. I mean, that's exactly what Jesus is. He is our bridge. There is no way we can get to the Father without Jesus. That is stated in Scripture that there's not many paths to heaven. There is that one ladder to heaven, and that one ladder is Jesus. Friends and faithful listeners, I hope you loved this episode, and if you did, please rate it and share it on your social media platforms and tell people that the Bible Explained podcast exists. Thank you to everybody who has been tuning in daily, and I am very appreciative of the notes that I've been getting. If you'd like to contact me, you can find my information in the bio of this podcast episode as usual. But faithful listeners, on Monday, I'm going to be having a guest on the podcast. His name is Casey Freeman, and he is a youth leader, and we're going to actually be talking about some crazy stuff. It's like a 40-minute long episode, just to let you know. And we're going to be talking about some really, really crazy things that are mentioned in Deuteronomy. And I think it's going to be really fun. So please tune into that episode on Monday. But faithful listeners, if you want to subscribe to the website, you're going to get 2 free chapters of my book, Out of the Mire. And if you want to read the rest of the book after you receive your 2 free chapters from subscribing to the email list, you can go over to Amazon and check out the book yourself and get a copy for yourself. Faithful listeners, I'll see you tomorrow morning for an episode out of Deuteronomy. Until then, happy listening and God bless.